as you've had conversations with people and they've brought up these questions and you've answered them in the way that you do in the book, what has been their reaction to some of those answers?
Most of the people are pretty surprised. A lot of the people never thought there were any answers. I'll sit down with somebody and talk about evolution, and they're just kind of blown away in a way because they've never heard that. I mean, every time you go to a museum, every time you read a newspaper article or a magazine article about something in nature, whatever, just sort of assumes that you go to a national park and they'll tell you about how, 15 million years ago, such and such occurred, and you sort of assume that there's this evolutionary bent behind it. And people haven't really thought about it. It's really kind of amazing. One of the things I say that about evolution is that it doesn't make sense theoretically. Now, I talk about some of the specifics of God's design and how everything is put like that. But theoretically, it doesn't make sense to have a half a wing. If you're going to be transitioning from a reptile to a bird and you suddenly have a half a wing, that doesn't help you. It actually, you're going to die more quickly. You can have, legs, or you can have wings, but if you have a half a wing, half a leg, it doesn't work. It has to be fully functional in order for it to be of use. And the interesting thing is when you look at the fossil record and you look at what life is like now in terms of the world, they're all fully formed creatures. Now, you may have a lot of different things about creatures. You can have some, frogs who start out swimming in the water and then they get onto the land, but they had gills that worked and they had lungs that worked. They didn't have half a gill and half a lung, so that it didn't work as a gill and it didn't work as a lung. You got to have, the whole thing has to be in place. I use the example of the bombardier beetle as one of these things, their defense mechanism, which is really quite fascinating, that this creature is able to actually fire hot gases in the face of a predator, and how that all works together is amazing. One of the comments, my friend, I mentioned in the book, but my friend said to me one time, how would you design a better squirrel? I was sitting out in my office at one point in another house where I actually had a window out in the office. And I was watching this squirrel jump from one branch to another and swing around and man, that's amazing what that creature can do. And if you ask the squirrel, do you want to become something different? He said, no, I really like nuts and I like jumping from one place to another, and it's kind of really cool. So, God has just done all these things. I can't remember what your original question was. I kind of got off on a rabbit trail there.
Oh, that's good.
That was great. I love
one of the things you said, you mentioned how theoretically evolution doesn't make sense, and that's so true, because also if you're going from water to land, what's to say to that species that land is a better environment for it to live in? Like they don't have there's nothing there to push them to drive to go to the land. Because there's a lot of predators. It's like, well, there's a lot of predators anyways, and a bunch of those fish didn't jump out of the water and grow legs. And so then it's like, well, yeah, who's to say that, there's going to be, where's the knowledge for them come from? Like, there's food and there's the safety, and who's to say there's not predators out there? Or when you have the land animals, it's like, who's to say that growing wings is the best way to go?
What guides it?
Yeah, what's the guiding compass to say, if I could fly, that would be better. It would be a lot harder than what I'm doing now. There'd be a lot less places to live. It'd be like, and I have to make my bones hollow, and they're not right now. And so there's nothing to guide the decisions.
Right.
This is arbitrary.
One of your comment there about the hollow bones. If you've ever gone to a zoo, and you'll see sometimes they'll have a man who will have on his arm a big hawk, right? And or maybe even an eagle, not so much an eagle. And he just, it's almost light. It's very light. If you had an animal that size, it's like, oh my goodness, that's really heavy. Well, just having feathers doesn't enable you to fly. You got to have hollow bones. You have to have the certain kinds of muscles that work to be able to flap your wings properly. You have to have all kinds of things to make that work. And again, it has to be all in place or it doesn't work. What I use the illustration in my book is of a vehicle junkyard. If you went to a vehicle junkyard and you applied the evolutionary principles to it, you'd look at it and say, I think what started out as a unicycle gradually developed into a bicycle, and then a tricycle, and then it went to an automobile that maybe a Fiat. I happen to like Fiats, and eventually it became a BMW, because the BMW current. Whoops, I think I lost you guys. There you are.
Yeah, you put out a little bit there.
Yeah. I'll do that again. You can, whatever it is. Anyway, what started out as a unicycle became a bicycle, and then a tricycle, and then a Fiat Spider, and then a Cadillac limousine, and finally a BMW, because the BMW's advertising slogan is the ultimate driving machine. So you could say that that's what happened, but in all probability, each one of those was designed by a designer. And so if you look at what's happening in nature, to say that something just gradually developed into something else, or to look at it from a perspective of a divine designer, it's much more reasonable to believe that there was a designer who put it all together.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah, that's good. Well, as we come to the end of the show, we changed our last question that we asked guests. The first time you were on, we asked you what would be the largest predator you could take out with any melee weapon. We changed it.
Now more suitable for the show.
Yeah, now it's a little bit more suitable. So the question we asked everybody now is, what has been the hardest question you faced in your Christian walk or experience, and how did you overcome to keep you a Christian? And it kind of goes really well with this episode, because we're talking about this whole book that deals with some of those questions.
Yeah, I think the hardest question, that's a very good question, by the way, and that's a hard one. I think the hardest question was, why would God command the children of Israel to completely wipe out an entire civilization?
It's a hard one.
That's a big issue. And what happened was, I was in seminary, and nobody ever really addressed that issue very much. They just kind of, most of the answers that I found were not very satisfying. They usually
they're pretty vague.
Yeah, they're vague, and they just kind of get around it. I was in a class. I can't remember what the class was. I think World Mission of the Church. J. Christie Wilson was the professor, and he made a side comment. I mean, this was not even part of, I don't even know why he said it, but he made the side comment that in ancient Canaan, there was rampant venereal disease because of their immoral lifestyle. And I thought, I didn't know that. What happens with disease? Disease passes from one place to another. And in a way, you have that passing not just from one person to another, but from one generation to another. Back in, I guess it was in the 70s, late 70s into the 80s, when the AIDS epidemic came, all of a sudden, you suddenly realize that there was these children that were born with AIDS because of the immoral lifestyle of their parents. And it's like, wow. So disease can go from very rapidly through a particular culture, and it can go from one generation to the next generation. How do you get rid of disease? You got to burn it. You just got to get rid of it. Now, that's not the only reason of why God does that, but that was one of the things that really helped me understand that there are factors that I don't know about, that I've never thought about, that God is very much aware of. And so if I'm going to eradicate disease, in fact, one of the things I say in my book about that kind of general issue is God has set a limit on the amount of pain he will allow any one individual to experience. That's one of the things that happened with regard to the torture part of that when men were being tortured, certain parts of their bodies would either go numb or they'd go unconscious. So God has set a limit. Now, we may think that the limit is too broad, but from God's perspective, he has decided that there is a limit on how much pain any one individual can actually experience. Because if it gets beyond this one level, an area of the body will go numb, the person will go unconscious, or they'll die one way or another. I mean, there's a limit. But he's also done the same thing for what he will allow, the amount of pain he will allow any individual culture to experience. And if you look back through history, you'll see that cultures that have promoted things that really result ultimately in pain and suffering in one, either emotional or physical. In the case of Canaan, a lot of that was physical suffering that came through venereal diseases and other communicable diseases that they had back then. God says, okay, now is the time for an end to that culture. And the interesting thing is that Abraham, when God talks to Abraham, he says, I'm going to send you into this promised land, but not yet, because the sin of the Amorites is not yet full. When it got to a point where God said, okay, now it's full, I've got to wipe it out. And at that point, I have to wipe it out and burn it, because I've got to get rid of the disease, as well as other things that were going on there. So I think for me, that was the hardest question to address on that. So
that's good. Thanks for your answer. Yeah.
Yeah. And with the 400 years too of like, hey, the sin's not yet complete. It's also a form of mercy where he's given them time to repent, so his justice is not without his mercy. His judgment is not without his mercy.
Yeah. Well, do you have any new projects you're working on or anything like that you want to plug to everybody else? Any places you want to send people that are listening?
Well, they can go to my website, georgewsaris.com. I'm actually trying to revise that. It was interesting. I was interviewed by Eric Metaxas. I don't know if you know Eric, but he has a radio show, and good man. He's a friend. And I was on the show, and he never mentioned that you can go to Amazon.com and order Searching for Truth in Vegas, Hollywood, and Bethlehem. He said, yeah, just go to georgewsaris.com. I thought, I don't even have it mentioned on my my website yet. And now, fortunately, he had pre-recorded it. And he wasn't going to air it for a few days. So
there you go.
I said, I got to get something on my website that has my So it was rash, running crazy to try to do that. But georgewsaris.com, hopefully in the not too distant future, it will actually be a better website than it is currently, but it kind of tells about who I am. But the next, just a friend of mine, actually my agent in New York, I'll mention one other thing. If people do want to hear my voice, if you hear a commercial for Puffs Tissues, the tagline is, a nose in need deserves Puffs indeed. That's my voice. So
there you go.
I'm the voice of Puffs Tissues. But anyway, my agent in New York is a good man. I think he's the only growing Christian agent in the entire world who deals with these kinds of things. But he's a great man. And over the years, I've talked to him about families, being a husband, being a father, etc. And he has encouraged me on a number of occasions to write a book on what is a man. And just the other night, somebody said to me, George, you ought to write a book about what is a man. And my wife has been encouraging me to write a book about what is a man. And so I may do that. I gave a series of talks a number of years ago at a men's retreat on what is a man. And a man is not what we typically see as this macho, overpowering person. There's a sensitivity. I mean, really, the best man is Jesus of Nazareth, obviously. But looking at what is a man. But that'll take a lot of time for me to work on that and come up.
Well, that's great. We'll look forward to hearing about that book hopefully in the future then.
Yeah, that'll be great.
Yeah. Awesome, George. Well, thanks so much for coming on. Everybody know where to check him out. We'll also have his link in the description and all that kind of stuff.